Okay, let's dive in. Imagine this for a second. The history you learned, those timelines you kind of just accept, they might be totally off.
And not just a little off.
No, like fundamentally wrong. We're talking centuries missing. Hundreds of years, emperors, big events, just poof, gone. Or maybe never there.
It sounds completely wild, doesn't it? Almost like science fiction. But that's the core claim, the really bold claim of something called the phantom time hypothesis.
Phantom time, but
Yeah, it suggests that a chunk of the early Middle Ages, nearly 300 years, roughly AD 614 to 911, was just fabricated, made up, inserted into our historical record.
So the calendar we use is off by almost 3 whole centuries
Mhm.
because someone way back when just decided to add extra time. That's a huge claim.
It's massive. It would completely upend our understanding of that whole era.
Right. So in this deep dive, we're going to unpack this. We're looking at sources like Wikipedia, but also material specifically focused on debunking it, like the phantom time hypothesis debunked.
Exactly. We want to look at where this idea came from, who's pushing it, what they claim is evidence, and that's a key word, claim.
And then crucially, why pretty much all mainstream historians look at this and say, no, that just doesn't hold up.
Right. It's a fascinating look into how we actually construct history, how we build timelines, and, well, what happens when someone tries to tear it all down.
Okay, so where did this all start? Who's the main person behind this idea?
The key figure is a German historian, or maybe more accurately, a historical writer named Herbert Illig. He first published this idea back in 1991.
And he wasn't just a standard academic historian, was he? His background involved like revisionist history groups.
That's right. He's been involved with associations focused on, let's say, unconventional views of history, including revisionism and catastrophism. He wrote books about it, like one called Das erfundene Mittelalter, The Invented Middle Ages.
The Invented Middle Ages. Okay,
Yeah.
pretty clear title. And the specific time period he targets is AD 614 to 911. Exactly 297 years. He says it wasn't an accident, but deliberate.
That's the core assertion, a conspiracy. Illig argues it was orchestrated by figures like the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II around the year 1000.
An emperor and a pope cooking the books on time itself. Why would they do that, according to Illig?
Well, the theory goes they wanted to manipulate the Anno Domini dating system, the AD system. They supposedly wanted Otto III's reign to fall exactly on the big, round, symbolic year AD 1000. Make it seem extra special, divinely timed, perhaps.
Okay.
So to do that, and maybe to bolster Otto's claim to the Holy Roman Empire, they allegedly needed to pad the timeline, create a longer history leading up to him. So they invented those 297 years and filled them with, well, invented events and people.
Wow. Okay, so if they invented almost 300 years, what does that mean for the figures in that period? Like Charlemagne,
According to Illig's hypothesis, Charlemagne is a fiction.
the whole Carolingian Empire. Just made up.
Pretty much. The entire period, a cornerstone of European history, becomes an elaborate fabrication designed to fill this phantom time slot. And the mechanism, altering documents, misrepresenting evidence, outright forgery.
Okay, that is an extraordinary claim. So as they say, it needs extraordinary evidence. What do Illig and his supporters actually point to? What's their proof?
They bring up a few main lines of argument. One big one has to do with physical evidence, archaeology.
What's the argument about archaeology?
They claim that for this specific period, AD 614 to 911, there's a suspicious lack of archaeological evidence, especially like significant architecture or major urban development in Western Europe. Things seem sparse, they argue.
But people do find things from that era, right? How do they account for that?
Well, they tend to question the dating methods. They argue that techniques like radiocarbon dating or dendrochronology tree ring dating aren't really precise enough for this relatively recent period.
They think the dating is unreliable.
Yes, or they suggest historians rely too much on written sources, which could be forged, instead of the physical stuff. They also point to architecture, like Romanesque styles appearing in the 10th century.
How does that fit in?
They argue it looks quite similar to Roman architecture, and if the Roman era wasn't that long ago because 300 years didn't happen, then that architectural continuity makes more sense to them. The gap seems shorter.
Interesting argument. So a perceived lack of physical evidence, doubts about dating, and architectural continuity. What else? What about written records?
That's another key point for them. They suggest there are very few original verifiable documents from that specific 614 and 911 window.
So lots of copies, maybe later forgeries.
That's the claim, that many texts we think are from that period might actually be later creations made to back up the invented history.
And this connects back to Charlemagne again.
It does. They see Charlemagne as this huge figure who sort of bursts onto the scene without, in their view, a clear, long period of documented development beforehand. It feels too sudden, too manufactured to them, like an insertion.
Okay, archaeology doubts, document doubts. And the third main point is the calendar math, right? This sounds like the technical core.
Yes. This is often presented as Illig's strongest piece of evidence. It's all about the Gregorian calendar reform.
Pope Gregory III, 1582. Fixing the old Julian calendar because it was drifting against the seasons.
Exactly. The Julian calendar's leap year rule was slightly off, adding a bit too much time. Over centuries, the calendar dates slipped relative to the actual solar year, the seasons. By 1582, things like the spring equinox were happening much earlier on the calendar than they should have been.
So how does Illig use this drift?
Okay, so Illig did a calculation. He figured, based on the known error rate of the Julian calendar since Julius Caesar introduced it way back in 45 BC, that by 1582, the calendar should have drifted by about 13 days compared to the true solar year.
13 days of accumulated error. Makes sense.
But when Pope Gregory III astronomers actually measured the drift they needed to correct, they found it was only 10 days.
Okay, so 13 days expected, but only 10 days observed. A 3-day difference.
Precisely. And Illig seized on this. He argued that this 3-day discrepancy is the proof. Those 3 missing days of drift represent roughly 3 centuries, 297 years. Conveniently, that never actually happened, but were counted anyway. That's the phantom time.
Huh. That sounds specific, almost scientific if you don't know the details, but I get the feeling mainstream historians have a pretty solid answer for this.
Oh, they absolutely do. And the consensus among historians, astronomers, archaeologists, basically everyone who studies this stuff, is that the phantom time hypothesis just doesn't work. It's not supported by the evidence. Let's tackle that calendar argument first.
Right, the missing 3 days equaling 3 centuries. What's the flaw there?
The flaw is fundamental. It's about what the Gregorian reform was trying to fix. Pope Gregory wasn't trying to reset the calendar back to how it was in 45 BC when Julius Caesar started it.
Okay, so what was the baseline year they were aiming for?
They were aiming to correct the drift that had occurred since the Council of Nicaea in AD 325.
325 AD. Why was that year the benchmark?
Because the Council of Nicaea was incredibly important for Christianity, especially for setting a standard way to calculate the date of Easter. And their calculations relied on the vernal equinox, the start of spring falling on March 21st, in the Julian calendar of that time.
Got it. So they wanted Easter calculations to work like they did back in 325 AD?
Exactly. But by 1582, because the Julian calendar had been drifting for over 1,200 years since Nicaea, the actual astronomical equinox was happening around March 10th or 11th.
Ah, so the drift since 325 AD was about 10 days.
Precisely. The 10-day correction ordered by Pope Gregory was exactly the amount needed to shift the calendar date of the equinox back to March 21st, matching its position in 325 AD.
So Illig's calculation of a 13-day total drift from 45 BC might be right, but irrelevant.
Exactly. The 3 extra days of drift that Illig focuses on, that's the drift that happened between 45 BC and 325 AD. It's real drift, but it occurred before the period the Gregorian reform was concerned with. He essentially used the wrong starting point for the correction baseline.
Wow. Okay, so the whole mathematical linchpin of the theory is based on a misunderstanding of the Gregorian reform's purpose. That's pretty damning.
It's a major reason why it's dismissed outright by experts in calendars and astronomy. But the problems go way beyond just the calendar math. What about that claim of archaeological scarcity?
Yeah, do historians agree that there's just not much stuff from 614 to 911?
No, not at all. Mainstream archaeology finds abundant evidence. There are countless settlements, artifacts, coins, building ruins, burial sites, you name it, across Europe, the Byzantine world, the Middle East, even parts of Asia that are reliably dated to this exact period.
So the claim of scarcity is just not accurate.
It seems to be based on a selective reading, perhaps, or just incorrect. And the dating methods, Illig questions. Dendrochronology and radiocarbon dating. They are well-established, cross-verified methods that work very well for this period and consistently support the standard timeline.
So the physical evidence is there, and the dating does work. What about the documents? The idea that most of them are forgeries from this phantom period.
Well, look, forgery definitely happened in the Middle Ages, no question. But the idea that most or all documents from a 300-year span are fakes, that requires an unbelievable conspiracy. We have huge numbers of texts from this period, chronicles, letters, legal documents, religious texts.
And they exist in different places, copied by different people.
Yes, often found in multiple copies from different regions, written in evolving styles of script, and they're often referenced or corroborated by later sources that are undoubtedly authentic. To dismiss all of that requires assuming a coordinated, centuries-long pan-European forgery effort that left no trace of itself. It's just not plausible.
And maybe the biggest problem comes when you don't just look at Europe, but the whole world at that time.
Absolutely. This is maybe the most powerful refutation. The period Illig wants to erase, AD 614-911, wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was a time of huge documented events across many civilizations.
Who else was around and keeping records?
You've got the Byzantine Empire, the successor to Rome in the East, with meticulous records. Critically, this period covers the life of Muhammad, the rise of Islam, and the massive early Islamic conquests.
Which created a huge empire with its own administration.
Exactly, stretching from Spain to Central Asia with detailed chronicles, coinage, and administration. At the same time, you have the Tang dynasty in China, one of the high points of Chinese civilization, incredibly well documented, keeping astronomical records and interacting with its neighbors, including the Islamic Caliphate. Think Battle of Palis in 751.
Okay, yeah. And developments in England. The papacy?
Anglo-Saxon England, the papacy in Rome, various kingdoms across Europe all have their own histories, their own records, their own sequences of events during this time.
So if you just erase 300 years from the European calendar, how does that possibly line up with the continuous history recorded in Byzantium, the Islamic world, China?
It doesn't. That's the core issue. All these different cultures, often rivals or even enemies, maintained their own independent timelines and records, dynastic successions, major battles, astronomical events like eclipses or comets, like Halley's Comet sightings.
And they all align with the standard chronology, not Illig's shortened one.
They all align with the standard AD timeline. For the phantom time hypothesis to be true, you'd need a conspiracy that wasn't just European, but global. You'd need Otto III and the Pope somehow coordinating with Byzantine emperors, Islamic caliphs, and Chinese imperial courts to simultaneously insert the exact same 297 years into everyone's history books, complete with fake events, and keep it secret forever.
That sounds completely impossible, logistically, politically.
Historians find it utterly implausible. The sheer weight of converging independent evidence from so many different sources, cultures, and scientific disciplines makes the standard timeline incredibly robust. The phantom time hypothesis simply collapses under that weight.
Okay, so the evidence against it is overwhelming. Yet, these kinds of theories, historical conspiracies, they do seem to grab people. Why do you think an idea like phantom time resonates with some?
Well, there's definitely a basic human appeal to the idea of uncovering a hidden truth, right? Something that the establishment, the mainstream, has missed or maybe even covered up.
It makes you feel like you're in on a secret.
Exactly. And specifically for this theory, the period it targets, the early Middle Ages, overlaps with what people used to call the Dark Ages. Now, historians don't really use that term anymore because it's a huge oversimplification.
But the popular image is maybe one of less documentation, less clarity.
Perhaps. For some, that old perception of historical sparseness might make the idea of missing time feel a bit more believable, even though the reality is much more complex and documented.
And then there's just the general human tendency to sometimes see patterns where there aren't any, or to be skeptical of authority, including academic historians.
For sure. Apophenia, seeing patterns, and a distrust of official narratives can definitely fuel interest in these alternative theories. But, theories like this, even though they're debunked, are actually kind of useful.
How so?
They really highlight why the methods of professional history are so important. Things like demanding strong evidence, relying on multiple independent sources, cross-checking with different fields like archaeology or astronomy, and the whole peer review process. That system is designed precisely to test claims like the phantom time hypothesis against the actual evidence.
It forces you to show your work, essentially, and the work behind phantom time just doesn't add up.
It really doesn't. It's a fascinating concept, very imaginative, a bold challenge.
But when you examine the actual arguments, the calendar math mistake, the claims about archaeology that don't match the findings, the sheer impossibility of a global conspiracy across hostile empires, it falls apart.
Yeah, the overwhelming evidence from astronomy, archaeology, written records from countless independent sources across continents all confirm the standard timeline. Historians reject the hypothesis not out of stubbornness, but because it's contradicted by facts.
So ultimately, phantom time doesn't change our history books. But maybe it serves as a really good lesson, a case study in how we piece together the past bit by bit using all these different kinds of evidence.
Exactly. It reminds us why critical thinking is vital when we encounter any claim about history, especially the really dramatic ones. And it helps us understand why the established historical narrative is established usually. It's because it has the best, most comprehensive evidence supporting it.
Historical truth isn't just about a story sounding plausible. It's about whether that story actually fits the evidence left behind.
Well said. It has to align with the messy, complex, but verifiable details.
Which brings us to a final thought for you. Listening. When you hear about a theory like the phantom time hypothesis, one that tries to unravel our fundamental understanding of time, using specific, though ultimately flawed, arguments, what does that tell you about historical truth itself? How do you decide what to trust when you read about the past? What makes one account feel solid and reliable while another one feels, well, like a phantom? Something to ponder.